All right. So today I want to talk about the valuable staples of the English Empire. I want to talk a little bit about mercantilism and how mercantilism changes in this period, and basically how New England is able to scooch into this mercantilist framework. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about enslaved people because I talked about the Jacobites and I talked about the Palatines last class, but I didn't really have that much time to talk about the Africans. And I want to talk a little bit about Africans in the New World and the differences between the sort of experiences that Africans had in, say, Jamaica, the Caribbean, the lower South, say South Carolina and Virginia. Right. Those exchequer bonds, right? They're actually probably much more valuable now as pieces of paper than they are as bonds since they're already paid off. Um, okay, so to start with, let me just briefly review mercantilism. To do that, I have to open up another my mercantilism slide. Okay, so just to review. Oh, you can't see that one, can you? Okay. Bear with me here for a second. AK scooching. There we are. Okay, apologies. So this is the image that of mercantilism. This is the dream that Europe and Britain in particular, but also other European countries have. And this is the reality. The reality is that the people who are benefiting increasingly from this mercantile framework are New England merchants. So I want to talk a little bit about how that works. The mercantilist laws that are passed they start in 1651, and they're basically designed to lock in the colonies to Great Britain. So the lock-in of the colonies to Great Britain is because increasingly Dutch traders are going to Virginia, Dutch traders are going to South Carolina. They're engaged in this trade, and the Dutch didn't put people there. The British believed that they should be the only beneficiaries of this trade. And so a couple people asked what's different about international trade then and now on packback. And what's really different is that this is kind of monopoly trade, more or less. That the British want a monopoly in these colonial goods when they create these long supply chains that go from the Caribbean to the New World, to the Old World. And they do this with mercantilism, and that was discussed a little bit in the last chapter and a little bit in this chapter. So the mercantilist laws are merchant marine that says only English boats. But luckily for New England, that includes those boats are defined as being for England and its colonies. 1651 are foreign trading monopolies. Only English traders are allowed to trade with the American colonies. 1661 is the enumerated commodities. The valuable ones, right? Sugar, tobacco, and dyestuffs, they have to go to British ports first. So that means if sugar is coming from the Caribbean, like, let's see, where would that, sugar coming from Barbados or Jamaica, it has to, and it wants, and a person who is a seller of sugar, if that sugar is sold to Dutch people, it has to go to England first. So it has to stop at an English port, touch an English port, and then go to, say, Amsterdam or Rotterdam. It has to touch an English port before it goes to France. It has to touch an English port on its way. So it has to go to those ports first to enforce that triangular trade. By 1673, there are customs officers. By 1675, there's much more direct enforcement of this. And I talked then about how the old triangle was the dream, right? The dream was that that Africans would be enslaved and brought over to the New World in this old triangle. So European goods, this is not showing up, but European goods would flow to Africa. Then African goods, African people, horrifically, would be transported to the Caribbean and the colonies, and then the Caribbean and the colonies would ship back tobacco and rice and indigo and skins and things like that. That's the dream of the triangular trade under the mercantilist system. What happens, though, increasingly is a new triangle that emerges where New England wedges itself, scooches itself in between this triangular trade and creates a new triangle where New Englanders are getting sugar from Jamaica, taking that sugar and turning it into rum, and taking that rum to the west coast of Africa, and then to buy enslaved people, and then having those enslaved people shipped back to the Caribbean. And then again, the products of the Caribbean going back to New England. Okay, so that's the new triangle that emerges. Okay, so let me just suggest a fanciful. Yeah, rum created the new triangle. I'll talk more about this, but rum is the really crucial issue. It's possible, technically possible, to produce rum in Jamaica, but it's actually complicated. And the people who have the know-how to do it are New Englanders, increasingly. Okay, this is just a kind of imagined conversation between two New England merchants. We'll start with fish. They send the rum to Africa for where it's traded for enslaved people. To those forts where the Lanzados are and where enslaved people are transported back to the New World. Okay, so New England is very heavily involved in the slave trade by the 1730s and 1740s, even though Britain wants England only to be the only beneficiary of the slave trade. So this is an imagined conversation. We'll start with fish, livestock, flour, and lumber. Those are things that all the British need for their that financial revolution, the powering of these new ships and things like that. Then we'll sell everything the Caribbean colonies want, like rum, paper, and nails. Also, because our ships are labeled British ships, we'll get English bounties. Haha, the British get nothing. So that's what happens in New England, basically from 1720s to the 1770s, is New England is told not to engage in manufacture. It's told not to engage in direct trade, and they do it anyways. So this is a Rittenhouse paper mill built in 1705. Built in 1705, and it converted old rag paper for old rags into paper for books and newspaper publishers, and it secretly violated the English Navigation Acts. There's not much manufacture in New England. I don't want to suggest that most people are engaged in manufacture, but there is some, and it's illegal according to the mercantile laws, according to the Navigation Acts and things like that. Rhode Island issues its own currency, which again, it's not supposed to do, but it does it anyways, in a way to kind of invest itself in this new world. So now I want to talk a little bit about Africans in this system. Oops. Okay. This is an image from an Antigua plantation in the 1700s. All right. Europeans use force to attract people to this zone. They enslave people, in fact, to get them into this zone. You think of Europe, a relatively isolated community where certain foreign goods are very prized. Sugar is cultivated in Sicily, but was part of the dowry of queens. Pepper was for centuries the principal commerce for the Italian city-states, but much of it is controlled by the Turks. People who first came to the Caribbean, though, are part of this new model of extracting wealth, which is connected with this financial revolution. They came to promote enterprises. People did not come to work and produce goods. The first people who arrived in the Caribbean, they came to promote enterprises that would be worked by other people. The first of the people who does this is Martin Afonso de Souza, who comes. Sorry, check that out. Make sure I've got the name. Da Souza. It's Portuguese. And he is probably the first person to bring enslaved people to the Caribbean, and that's in 1531. And this is basically almost 100 years before the English do that in 1619 when enslaved people are brought to Jamestown. When we think about a plantation in the Caribbean, when we think about a sugar plantation or a coffee plantation or a cocoa plantation, and these are the real moneymakers in the New World, we should think about it as a combination of a military and commercial enterprise. Okay? The term entrepreneur, you've heard the term entrepreneur, it's a French term, and it meant a manager, in the 1400s, it meant a manager of a military enterprise. Okay, so an entrepreneur was someone who managed a military enterprise. It only gradually in the 15 and 1600s comes to mean someone who runs a commercial enterprise. It was entrepreneurs who came into this region and set up this military style plantation. They compared settlements in the temperate colonies, like New England, and to tropical colonization, which we would call, maybe war capitalism. There is a feudal background here. This is in some ways a feudal, or starts out as a feudal system. The land grants to the Caribbean were huge. They were made to entrepreneurs, and this is because policy was set by the king, and the king was inspired by courtiers and large landholders and nobles around the crown. There was uncleared land with difficult technical requirements, and they create this idea of the plantation of people, which becomes the cell and the building block of plantation society. It's a kind of a military organization. And let me just go back to this image. This is an image from an Antigua plantation in 1823. This is where the big house is. And you'll notice that there are massive gates around it. This is a military style institution. They, bear with me here, boiling. So this is where the food was kept. This is where enslavers lived, often overseers. And if there were slave revolts, and there were many revolts by enslaved people, they would pour boiling water over the edge at the people who were opposition to them. Yeah, it's because they're forced to work. It's a military setup because this is a system of force in which people are forced to work. They're on these little islands. So it's difficult for them to produce food on their own, and it's a kind of military style system. It's different from feudalism. It's different from the medieval feudal system. You've heard of feudalism, right? With a lord and they kept the grain there so that people would be fed on a daily basis, and if they didn't do the work that was required of them, they would not get food. So the grain was stored in these big houses at the top here in places like Antigua, and the boiling water was used. Where was it? Oh, this is Antigua. So Antigua, Jamaica, Barbados. Is that what you're asking? So this is where this is happening. And it's happening in Virginia too. That a lot of these plantations are the big houses at the center, and the big house is a kind of a military fort that's designed to keep enslaved people out. That's designed to sort of dominate them. So this is different from feudalism in a few ways. First of all, it's purchased workers from elsewhere, right? So these are enslaved people who are enslaved from other regions, enslaved from Africa, mostly, but also enslaved people from native people who are, for example, taken from South Carolina or what we now call South Carolina, and shipped to Jamaica or Barbados, Native American people. So it's purchased workers, number one. Number two, there's a different status based on color. That color is the thing that decides, that makes it easy to identify who's an enslaved worker and who's not. And color is what is part of that enforcement, because if you are dark-skinned and you don't have a pass, then you're assumed to be an escaped slave. And third, there's a production of a staple that's an expensive luxury good. Like tobacco, like sugar, like coffee, like cocoa. or a shipping good like hemp or turpentine. Um, Very tightly tied to long distance trade. The feudal system of the Middle Ages was all the trade was local. There was very little international trade. This is a system that's built on international trade. So some people, when they talk about whether slavery is capitalist or not, it's definitely tied to an international capitalist system in a way that feudalism wasn't. This is not feudalism much. But it is a military institution. It is an institution in which people lord over other people. But it's a few things that are different. It's based on color. People are imported as workers, and there's a production of this expensive luxury good that's going on in these Caribbean plantations. Okay, important about the Caribbean plantations too is that these courtiers and other, I keep saying that word, but I maybe should spell it. People who were connected to the crown in one way or another, who kind of were courted the crown, who were attracted to. These people had a powerful lobby in Great Britain. Okay, they were called the West India Interest, and these were their hangouts, their primary hangouts in London in 1823. Whitehall, right, where the king and the queen were, Buckingham Palace, the West India Clubhouse on St. James Street, Downing Street, the Houses of Parliament. Notice that this is all north of the Thames. This is where the most valuable real estate, most expensive real estate in London. This is where the West India planters are living. Some of them will come to Jamaica or Barbados. They'll stay there for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and then they'll go back and they'll collect the earnings that they make from these Caribbean plantations. Okay, this is very important. This is why Barbados and Jamaica and Antigua and other islands that Great Britain controlled are not states now. Yeah. Basically, the difference in the Caribbean plantations is that they are owned by people who are very powerful in England. Right? They're very powerful in England. There's does that make sense? Sorry, I don't understand the backslash. Is that also? Okay. Why are the earnings in Britain not with the people themselves? Okay, I see. No problem. Okay, why are the earnings in Britain not with the people themselves? So the people who are earning this, the people who own the plantations in the Caribbean, by and large, are actually living in London. They might have spent 3 or 4 or 5 years there, but they are absentee landlords. So they are people who have kind of more or less enslaved people, and then are living their lives in one of the wealthiest parts of the world, that is the North End of London. Okay, we talked a little about tobacco, and tobacco is different. Tobacco is somewhat different in that you see smaller plots. This is not a Caribbean context; it's a sort of Chesapeake context, so it's further north of the equator. We see this weird land settlement pattern where land is scattered all over the place. A great example of this, I was just looking over my notes, is in Georgia. In Georgia in 1770, so before the Revolution, the colony of Georgia had only just under 9 million acres of land in the entire state of Georgia, and they had given away 29 million acres of land, or sold 29 million acres of land. So there were constant battles over who owned what land, and there were multiple people getting title to the same land in Georgia. And so this was a very chaotic system in areas that are producing tobacco initially. But they're still hierarchically organized, and they're still organized somewhat in a military fashion, with the big house at the center. And we talked about African traditions, and there are African traditions in Virginia, but they're not as strong as they are in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, we see enslaved people escaping from, particularly in Barbados and particularly in Jamaica, people escaping the enslavers, moving off into the mountains, creating military encampments and preventing enslavers from coming into them. We call those maroon communities. They're mentioned a couple of times in the third and the fourth chapter. And these maroon communities basically make deals with the British, saying, leave us alone and we'll take care of ourselves. And so we see maroon communities in the Caribbean, which are very African. They're very, people speak a kind of Creole of African languages. They have a queen. They have, and this is still true. If you go to Jamaica now, the maroon communities are still there, the descendants of those maroon communities, and they are very African. They're very different from they are escaped slave, right? They are enslaved people who've escaped and go off to live in the mountains. And if you go to Jamaica today, you can visit these maroon communities. My wife does research on Jamaica and but basically Jamaican guest workers, and the cab driver wanted to take her to a maroon community because they sold the best pot, according to him. My wife was not all that keen on that, but so there are these maroon communities that are African communities that have separated themselves off entirely from the enslavers. There are attempts to do this in say North Carolina. There's a place called the Great Dismal Swamp right on the border between Virginia and North Carolina, where some enslaved people escaped. There's places in Florida where enslaved people escaped, but they're not really African communities in quite the same way that their Jamaican communities are. No, there's not really much mix of British culture. There's a little bit of British language that they speak, but it's very African because they were because they were outnumbered, right? Because these enslaved communities were powerful. There were maroon communities all through Central and South America and in the Caribbean. There were only a tiny few collections of maroon communities in North America, but they had arms, and they basically could kick the British's folks' ass. So sorry, I didn't mean to curse there, but they were numerous. They were armed. They could feed themselves, and they were capable of holding off British, even though they had initially come over as enslaved people. They kind of unenslaved themselves and established themselves in these regions. So we see maroon communities in the Caribbean, but we don't really see that many maroon communities in Virginia. Okay, now I want to talk about rice and South Carolina. Because if Virginia is one kind of society where it's a mix of sort of British and African traditions, South Carolina is a little bit more Caribbean. South Carolina is a little bit more African, in fact, quite a bit more African than these other regions. Okay, let's talk about rice then. South Carolina was originally settled by planters and enslaved people from the Barbados and the Bahamas, and it gives a Caribbean tone to the society in South Carolina. Rice was grown commercially after 1695, and it required very swampy soil, and but it had to be what's the word for half salt? It had to be either fresh water or what's half salty water called? What's that term? Brackish water. Yeah, it basically needed to grow it in a marsh. Yeah, brackish water. So rice, it eventually becomes the most pronounced in the region east of the Waccamaw River, which is here. I hope you can see that. Sometimes you can see my cursor and sometimes you can't, but that big black line in the center there is the Waccamaw River. And it was these freshwater swamps near the coast, which is parallel to the Atlantic, and it runs from Wilmington to Charleston. Waccamaw. Waccamaw River. All right. Unlike tobacco, this is very intensive agriculture. This is agriculture that where you increase productivity by applying labor and a lot of capital. Extensive agriculture is where it's a minimum amount of labor or expense. Intensive agriculture is what this is. The rice fields are bounded by huge embankments, And dams surround each field or square, which is 10 to 20 acres. Here is a aerial image of a former rice field in South Carolina. Okay, so a rice field is 10 or 20 acres, and they use the tides to produce the rice. The tides sweep the fresh water from the rock Waccamaw onto the plantations. The fields have huge floodgates, which allow you to control the tide. At high tide, the gates are opened to allow the water in to to flood the fields. This allows the rice to be nourished and to kill the weeds, because if you leave the water at about just 3 or 4 inches above the rice will grow up, but the weeds won't. And then you let it clear, and then you bring it in again, and you do these multiple times. So you need to basically use the tidal currents to prevent weeds from growing up among the rice. This allows the rice to be nourished because the fields would be emptied at other times. And South Carolina had a stink, right? It was like whack-a-mole, right? It had a stink. There was a smell, as you can imagine, leaving fresh water or brackish water sitting on a 10-acre area for 3 or 4 weeks. Creates the smell as you have bacteria and all these other sorts of things, and then mosquitoes. It's pretty dangerous, actually, because you've got yellow fever and all these other things that come from the mosquitoes. And people who are from South Carolina in the 1840s and 1850s would come to miss the smell, that stink. The rice was nourished by bringing in the fresh water. So you plant the rice, and then you leave the water in. And what the water does is it allows the rice to get nourished, because the rice needs the water, and it also holds up the rice plants for a little while. The weeds can't break through and get long enough, quick enough. The rice grows faster, and then you lower it down again, and then you remove weeds, and then you put the water back in again. Oh, extensive and intensive agriculture. Extensive agriculture is agriculture that requires minimum labor and expense, and so that would be like wheat or something like that, where you just plant it. Wheat is basically a weed. You plant it, you don't do anything with it, and then you come back later and you harvest it. Intensive agriculture, like this, you need to spend a lot to make it. You need to the more capital you put into it, the more valuable it's going to be. You need good dams. You need to support those dams and those sorts of things. So this is called intensive agriculture. And what's important about that is it meant that for the enslaved people who were brought to South Carolina, there was a preference for people who were from Senegambia, that's the northern part of the African coast, and northwestern part of the African coast. And people from Senegambia had rice skills. They knew how to grow rice. And so what you get there is a much more sort of Senegambian feel to the society. And while there's not shared languages, there is a kind of language that grows up among enslaved people called Gullah or Geechee. And this Gullah and Geechee language is a kind of mixture of a number of West African languages and English. The most visible evidence that it was enslaved people that built this region is that none of the white settlers who came knew anything about rice. People had books about rice, but most of the work and most of the kind of intellectual labor that went into creating these rice fields were in fact Africans who did this. The rice had to grow in fields that could be flooded. They cleared the trees, they leveled the ground, they built the dams. This was all very costly. Okay, some results of this kind of social makeup and this intensive agriculture was that the culture was kind of African and Afro-Caribbean. Very few whites or free blacks or biracial people in the immediate region. Meant that there were much more ties, pronounced ties between African and African-American culture. Okay, so what you see, for example, in South Carolina is many more stories that are West African stories about ghosts and about spiders and about a lot of the folk tales of the American South come from the Gullah Geechee region, come from the South Carolina rice region, because this is where the African traditions are carried over most distinctly, at least in North America. They're also carried over distinctly in French Caribbean and things like that. But in North America, this is the most African part of North America is South Carolina. It also has a task system, and the task system we saw that discussed in chapter 4, and some of you talked about the task system and what it does to African culture. When the job was finished, an enslaved person would be given a task. When the task was finished, the enslaved person was free to do what he or she wanted. And part of this was climate, right? Part of this was that in the summer, in, I don't know, June in South Carolina, if you're working in the fields at noon or 1 o'clock, you're very likely to kill yourself, right? It's incredibly hot and incredibly difficult. And so what people would do they would prefer to do the work in the morning or in the evening and complete their tasks. And the task system was in part because these people had the skills to produce the rice themselves, and the enslavers in many cases didn't know that much about how rice was cultivated, what its schedules were, what diseases came to the rice and stuff like that. This was a function in part of the control and knowledge that enslaved people had of production costs, and partly a result of the heat. Okay, the task system means that people are not working in gangs. People are doing their work and then they're leaving. They might be working side by side, but they're not working in gangs. And what we see is communication and language is mostly between enslaved Africans. And so that means that the language that they speak is a kind of mixture of a variety of African languages, many from Senegambia, some from Nigeria, and British languages. And so you can hear, and this is why people from South Carolina have a much stronger accent than other people. This is why people from South Carolina and from rural Georgia have that very strong accent. It's an African, it's picked up from African traditions. We don't think about it that way. We think about the Southern accent as being some sort of distinctive thing, but it's actually many of the verbs, many of the tenses, many of the way in which things are expressed come from a number of the West African language groups in this period. And you can look up Gullah and Geechee. In the past, I would play Gullah and Geechee, but I keep having this problem with Twitch where I'm not allowed to show things that are copyrighted, and YouTube won't let me share the video with you guys if it's something that's. But if you do a quick search of Gullah or Geechee and listen to the sound, it sounds like South Carolina speech to a certain extent, but it's got lots and lots of African words in it. Okay, another thing about South Carolina that makes it different from Virginia, besides this African cultural traditions and this task system, is a permanent. This is the winnowing machine where people are, where they're winnowing the rice, and this is the architecture. The architecture in South Carolina was permanent. Okay, unlike Virginia, where plantation houses would be built and then torn down in the space of 30 or 40 years. There aren't that many old Virginia plantation houses, in part because people were constantly moving west to better land. In South Carolina, the only place that you can grow rice effectively is here, right? On the west side of the Waccamaw River. And so the people who establish there and get there first, many of them who are these white wealthy planters, they stay there for multiple generations. Okay, so, and that's true of Africans who are there as well, too, that there's not a whole lot of movement, and you see people sort of staying in one region from one area to another. There was a slave trade in which enslaved people were traded, but many more came from Virginia than from South Carolina, because South Carolina was very profitable, and the people that were there, had these skills. After the first few decades of settlement, these plantations were permanent. With this kind of intensive investment in the land, you didn't move a plantation. More to the point, if someone blocked off the water from a river for a rice plantation, this prevented the water from going further downstream. So once you controlled the water, you basically controlled the land, and this also meant that further west of South Carolina, anywhere west of here, the land is much less valuable because you can't really produce rice in those regions. Okay, so this is going up to the 1770s. This is before cotton, but rice is important in South Carolina all the way up until 1865, up until the end of the Civil War. The result of this permanence is that the enslaved people who built this region and their children and their grandchildren and great grandchildren recognized the region as theirs. Unlike tobacco fields, which moved all over a plantation from year to year, the rice stayed in one place. Oh, sorry. it's, okay. Sorry about that. Should I go back? I didn't mean. Gosh. I really thought that I would be able to do quizzes. Okay, I'll go back. Basically, what you get is permanent plantations in South Carolina. People are permanent, and then there's also, and so plantation houses are there. If you go to Charleston now, you'll see houses that were built in the 17 teens and the 1720s. If you go to Williamsburg now, you won't. All you'll see is rebuilt. Things that were built in the 1950s to look like old plantation houses because all the old plantation houses were torn down. So what you see is a kind of permanent agriculture, architecture, and you also see a sense of place among Africans. These are the enslaved people who built this region, and they recognize the region as theirs. The urban pattern here was also hydrocephalic. No, that was what I hoped, was that I could do the quizzes on Twitch now, but I can't. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. I've tried to do the quiz thing now that I have access to it, and I don't think so. Usually it'll be at the beginning or the end of the class. I might do it at the beginning or I might do it at the end. I probably won't do it in the middle just because it's disruptive in terms of the lecture. Okay, so this makes South Carolina hydrocephalic. Hydrocephalus is water on the brain, but a hydrocephalic region in terms of geography is one where the cities are big, right? And so Charleston is the biggest city in, or the second biggest city in the South. For most of, after New Orleans, it's the second biggest city in the South for most of its history. What happens in Charleston, sorry, I lost my place. What happens in Charleston stays in Charleston. No, what happens in Charleston, how did I lose my, nothing is working today. Okay. Planters and the enslavers sought to escape the mosquitoes and the heat by going to Charleston. So the South Carolina is hydrocephalic in the sense that Charleston is so big. I guess that's the way to take it. And this is what geographers say. So what we see is a very large region, and this is what's distinctive about Charleston is the enslavers, to escape the mosquitoes and the heat, spend most of the year in Charleston. They come back for the harvest, and they're kind of oversee the transportation of the rice onto ships and things like that and the sale of it. But they're not there most of the year. And it's overseers and others that are there, and this region then is very different. And we saw then a couple of you, Anna and other people mentioned in the packback, that there's this independent economy that goes on there, and that is African women are producing food crops, yams and things like that, African food crops, and selling them in Charleston. They're also selling clothes that they're not supposed to be doing, right, with red colors, and all the sumptuary laws say that you can't wear, that Africans can't wear fancy clothes. But of course, that this is all being sold in these South Carolina markets. There's much more of what's called living out, which is discussed, I think, in the third chapter, where enslaved people basically hire out their labor. And so they set themselves up in Charleston. They pay a fee, either weekly or monthly or yearly, to their enslaver, and they basically live on their own. This is going to be important for understanding the culture of South Carolina when we talk about secession and when we talk about fears of slave revolts and things like that. But suffice to say, there's a much more independent African economy here. Many more skilled African sellers of goods who are bringing goods into Charleston, including these African goods like yams and sweet potatoes and other goods to be sold in the markets. And this is in part why South Carolina and Georgia cuisine is very different. The food is much more African as well. Okay, so we inside this framework then of a mercantile system, staples made the lives of enslaved people different very different in three different regions. In the tobacco region, control of credit and local goods establishes certain planter families and families of enslavers whose names are important, but enslaved people have to go are visiting from one plantation to another when they become couples and marry. They're not technically allowed to marry in the system of slavery, but they jump a broom and which officiates their kind of their coupling, and it's much more difficult to. There's much less of an African feel to the tobacco regions in Virginia. The sugar system in the Caribbean is much more directly harsh. There's much more of cutting off of hands and cutting off of feet in this system. Much more absentee ownership, right? And more direct armed conflicts. So this is where we will see many more slave revolts in the sugar plantations. There's more pronounced blending of African and African American traditions. There are massive infusions of enslaved people who die without children. Infanticide is also common in the sugar regions, particularly the Caribbean. And third is the rice system, in which the rice plantations are established and they close out other plantations because they kind of effectively close off the water. And the rice system is somewhere between the Chesapeake and the Caribbean in terms of African culture. It's not as African as the Caribbean, but it's more African than the Chesapeake. That's right. Enslaved Africans. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, thank you. I missed the question and the answer. So that's it. Enslaved Africans weren't allowed to get married technically, so they jumped over a broom to symbolize the marriage. Thank you, CRS. First system was the tobacco system, and we talked about that last week, in which tobacco control of credit and goods establishes the families, and there's much less of an African character to that society, or it's a blend of African and British traditions. But it's when you listen to the accents, you look at the food, it looks more British. The sugar system, which is more harsh, and then the rice system. Okay, in the South, black slavery makes So in the South, slavery is, when we talk about these regions, the lives of Africans are very different in these different places. Their experience, their ability to control their own destinies is in some ways stronger in places like the rice regions of South Carolina than it is in the places like the tobacco regions of Virginia. The harshest regime by far in terms of death, in terms of violence towards enslaved people and stuff like that, would be the sugar system. Okay. Oh no. Oh, sorry. All the text is white here. All right. There we go. All right. Yeah. Yeah. It's not. I mean, I have one enslaved ancestor who's from Baltimore, so better or worse, it's hard to say. But I, rice, I think, is more. It's a more like if you're talking about cultural survival, I would say rice is a better region. If you're talking about quality of life, I suppose, and the ability to control your own destiny, I would say rice is better. The labor is, it's horrible labor in any sense. Yeah, but no, it's a good question. It's hard to answer. It's hard to answer. It's just different in those experiences. But sugar is the most deadly, but it's also the most African. So it's hard to sort of say definitively which one's better or worse. No, I understand you weren't. Pretty much. The other place that uses the task system is in northeastern North Carolina, the where they made naval stores, things like tar and turpentine and pitch. Um, but that's mostly it. The rice plantations in Georgia, for example, there were rice plantations in Georgia, not as many, but they also have the task system. So generally, the task system is associated with rice. Yeah. And we'll talk about cotton later. Cotton doesn't come until after the revolution uh, in big numbers. I mean, there is cotton, but cotton sweeps across the South after the revolution. Cotton is a different system entirely. But yeah, the task system is generally a rice system. Okay, so let's plug this back into this African migrant. So when I'm spending more time talking about the lives of Africans because there are a larger number of the people who are here in the New World. The difficulty is, of course, finding sources for describing African life because it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read, and there aren't that many literary documents that we have that aren't, in fact, from enslavers. So I want to try to explain to a certain extent what this experience is like. Okay, if we look at enslaved Africans brought in the 1700s from, say, what I would call the financial revolution from 1700 to, 1750. Let me move this over. Let's shrink it down a little bit if I can. That'll show me. Okay. Sorry. I've got white text on green background, so I apologize for that. But this darker gray area here, I guess, is the period of the financial revolution. And what's going on here in terms of numbers? It's hard to say. It says Europe, mainland North America, British Caribbean, French Caribbean, Dutch Americas, Danish West Indies, Spanish Americas. Oh, that's a great question. And in fact, they did. I mean, most skilled laborers in Virginia and South Carolina were black laborers. So carpenters, millwrights, uh, people who did ironwork, blacksmiths, all those people were generally enslaved people. There weren't that many white skilled workers in the South. Most skilled trades and professions were practiced by black people. Um, there aren't. There is Chinese skilled labor, but that's really comes after, by and large, after the American Civil War. So that would be in the period, basically, and that's particularly true in, say, New Orleans and places like that. But that's later than the period that we're talking about. Yeah, around 18. I would say the 1865 or later is. Yeah. Okay, so it's mostly going up over time. But you also see that it's much increasing through 1750s in most areas with a little decrease toward the end of the 1730s in other areas. Okay, look at the numbers. Compare the British Caribbean to the French Caribbean. Say in 1651 to 1660, the British Caribbean is bringing in 10 times more, bringing in about 23,000 Africans. But by 1681, it's bringing in 110,000, and then 128,000, then 140. Yeah, so the British Caribbean and the Brazil imported the most over time. Yeah, and this is enslaved Africans. So this is who it's so it's sorry, it's a little confusing for the chart, but this is enslaved Africans that are brought over, and there's many more enslaved Africans that are brought over in the period of the English financial revolution, and they outnumber the French Caribbean immigration considerably, particularly immediately after 1681. It's almost 10 times as many the British are bringing in 1680 to 1690, and even in 1720 to 1730, it's 3 times as many. There's really no time where Is that right? Yeah. It gets a little bit closer in the 1730s and the 1740s. So it's the British Caribbean, the British and mainland North America that Africans brought into those two regions. The numbers increased drastically with the financial revolution. So this is why the financial revolution matters, because it allows Britain to bring many more enslaved people to the New World than the other competing regions. And so this is my takeaway. This is why I think the financial revolution matters, because the financial revolution, this sort of fiscal transformation of the British state, is what allows a new kind of importation, a vast increase in the slave trade that allows basically the migrants to outnumber native people and the British, the people that are part of the British Americas to outnumber the French or the Dutch Americas. Okay. All right. Now I want to talk about. Sorry. Break. So I've talked about the lives of enslaved people in these three different regions, and now I want to talk about merchants. Because I said at the beginning that the merchants scooch their way into this triangular trade, but it's helpful to understand sugar and these other goods before we start talking about that. So, bear with me. Okay. Shipping was basically what it is that New England did from the 1690s forward. And during the time of the financial revolution, New England starts producing more and more boats. Now, partly that's just a question of where the timber is, right? There's not a lot of timber in Britain in this period. Shipping required tools, though, and iron forges sprung up in New England. And once they were making building tools, they could also produce agricultural implements so that New England farmers didn't have to buy English products. Artisans produced more clothing and shoes, which went to the islands, which went to the Caribbean islands that were the real moneymakers in this period. Women made money for their family by spinning wool into yarn and by weaving in their homes. And these industries would provide a foundation for what would later be the Industrial Revolution. I don't want to suggest that New England is industrial. It's not. But compared to the South, it is. Like there is some industry. It's all connected with shipping, though, right? It's rope walks that are producing rope. It's places that are producing shipping goods. That's where the industry, quote unquote, is. By 1700, 1 in 10 men in Boston were merchants. 1/6 of men in Boston had a share in a maritime venture, which meant that they were tied to this new triangular slave trade. They bought and sold things. They read newspapers. They made deals in coffee shops. And again, coffee shops were the places where most of the deal making took place. This is the sort of Wall Street of the 17th and the 18th century, of the 1600s and the 1700s. Barbados and South Carolina planters made fortunes. They collected books, but much of their communication with each other was in giving orders to overseers or ordering things by courier. In comparison, in New England, we see much more communication by print. There was a broad-based, diverse, argumentative community in Boston, compared to a austere, aristocratic, and dynastic world among whites in Charleston, say, or Bermuda. By the mid-18th century, 2/3 of the urban population worked in handicrafts. So this is, again, not exactly industry, it's artisan production. These were called leather apron men. And this included carpenters, coopers, shoemakers, tailors, blacksmiths, mast and sailmakers, masons, plasterers, weavers, potters, etc. They were generally well educated, and much of their craft is book learned rather than taught from a master artisan or apprentice. So this what had started in the 1600s as a sort of Puritan city on the hill becomes something very different with the rise of the financial revolution and the rise of international capitalism and international slavery. The most radical communitarian sects in England settled in the New World and become the home ground, weirdly, for an extremely sophisticated commercial class. They come to transplant old English ways, which have been corrupted by imperial power, and then they end up agents of the slave trade. Uh, okay, so a little bit about merchant households. Merchant households were organized around a merchant, and the household was the center of commerce and sociability. Offices were physically linked to houses, so people would have an office downstairs and a house upstairs. This is we haven't had that until this year, uh, but in the 17th century, it was just like everyone had COVID because offices were in people's houses and they were downstairs. Often, the wealthiest merchants did their correspondence downstairs and had bedrooms upstairs. Trading partners, ship's captains, and backcountry merchants would be received in the central room and discuss business. In parlor, within earshot of wives, daughters, and sons. And so this meant that wives had the wives of these merchants had much more kind of knowledge of the world than they would do of the business world than they would say in the 1860s or the 1870s. In the 1700s, these were wives of merchants were sort of partners in a certain sense. If a husband died, a wife might take over the business for a time while the husband's ships were coming in. They would manage correspondence and do things like that. So this is a very, for compared to women around the rest of the world, this is a much more kind of democratic system than much of the rest of the world in this period between men and women, at least between white men and women in New England. These households were linked to each other too. Without credit agencies, there was no way to determine somebody's creditworthiness. And so the merchants established transatlantic networks across the ocean. They would post a son or a son-in-law across the ocean or at another city. Daughters were married to other merchants, building alliances. And so some of the most powerful merchant families also tended to be in religious communities. So Quakers, for example, you could be expelled from the Quaker Church for not obeying a promise, not fulfilling a contract. So if you violated a contract, you would be expelled by the Quakers. This was a powerful force in making you keep your deals. It also meant that you could trust other Quakers if you traded with them because you knew that they would be expelled. And so this is one of the real reasons why the Quakers, who tended to be pretty, opposed to slavery, were often the most skilled and powerful slave traders at least in the beginning of the 1700s. The most skilled and powerful traders. Some of them, a few Quakers, refused to engage in the trade in slaves. But these commercial networks were often religious networks. This is also true in the small number of Jews and others in New York who would be connected to Jews and others in Europe. Also true of the Quakers, by and large, are the most powerful. And the Quakers, of course, are based in Philadelphia, a very important port in the 18th century. And the Quakers tended to dominate, and they tended to trust one another, in part because you could be expelled from the church. Okay. For example, a French pirate who had commandeered an American trading ship in the Caribbean in the 1760s. When he got aboard, he discovered it was a Quaker ship. He then asked the captain, who was not a Quaker, to sign a pledge saying that 1,000 pounds would be paid to him in Paris in 3 months. And the pirate then released the ship. And when the pirate was told later that he was a fool for taking a pledge and releasing the ship, he said, "I have no fear, this is a Quaker ship." And sure enough, the Quaker owner paid the 1,000-pound ransom, even though the pirate had nothing to hold over him or to force him to pay. Wives were crucial to the networks of Anglo-American traders. Before the Revolution, wills were often made out to them as executors. They had considerable latitude in determining how the trading routes and ships that their husbands controlled would be carried on. They would choose who would carry on the business. Some women, in fact, carried on the trade of their husbands after they died, as they're the best acquainted with those trading families. Another group of merchants that were important were the High Dutch families. And the High Dutch families meant that they were closer to the North Sea. They were pietists, they were anti-Catholic, And these were the people who dominated New York City trade. These High Dutch, and that's where the name you get the name like Rensselaer and Roosevelt and Van Dyke and these other Dutch names were the important Dutch traders in this period. Okay. It's these people that ultimately, through the use of rum, are able to, through the refinement of rum, are able to sort of take over and scooch into this trade. The conflict, let me go back here for a second to my image, right? And so we have this old triangle, which they tried to enforce with the Navigation Acts. Britain tried to enforce the Navigation Acts. Increasingly, New England merchants are sort of scooching their way in and creating a new triangle in which New England replaces England in this triangle between the Caribbean, Africa, and and the third place. The third place goes from being England increasingly to being New England. And that conflict, that power of New England merchants to sort of sneak their way into this internal slave trade is going to be important in terms of as a cause for the revolution. Another cause for the revolution is going to be the merchants, the Scottish merchants who are gouging their customers in Virginia. These Scottish merchants are going to be, the opposition to Scottish merchants is going to help fire up Virginians, white Virginians, who feel like they've been had by Scottish merchants. We'll talk about that after the exam. Okay, a couple review for the exam. There's a couple of terms that I would suggest you think about. One of them is war capitalism, and the other is financial revolution. I guess this should be obvious, but those would be the two things that I would. War capitalism and the financial revolution. Those are things that are not really discussed as such in the readings. And so what I'll ask you to do is to sort of compare my argument about war capitalism or the financial revolution to the book's arguments in particularly chapters 3 and 4 of the book. Other questions that people have about that? We've got a little time until on Thursday we'll be talking about. Yeah, the lectures are on YouTube. And there it's listed on the syllabus. What did I say? Stinky Scott was the name. Yeah, so all these lectures are available on YouTube. I have been updating the PowerPoints, and the PowerPoints will all be available on YouTube. If you look, you'll see the. We'll come to class when I'll basically assign it. I'll ask if people have any questions about the question, and then that'll be it. Oh, thank you. That's fine. We've got some time. So you'll have 24 hours to turn it in, but I'll ask, however, take your time looking at YouTube or whatever. But I ask you only spend about an hour writing it. Obviously, I can't control that, but it'll be due. So 11:10 is when I'll post it on Tuesday, and it'll be due 11:10 on Wednesday. You can post it anytime before that as an attachment in ELC, as a Word file. No, I'm not going to pose a timer. I can't, So basically, give yourself an hour. Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's a good question. Uh, yeah, docx, yeah, something that's a Word file. Okay, so let me answer this question. This is a complicated question, and it's got a somewhat complicated answer. English plantation owners would go to their land in the Caribbean for 3 to 5 years, and they would return to Britain and collect the earnings. You would thought they would have to collect the physical earnings from the plantation, but no, they didn't, because you would be paid in the so basically the contract would be back to this triangular trade. Glad I've got this triangular trade here. The person would be paid, let's say, at the port in Cuba with a sterling bill of exchange. Okay, and this sterling bill of exchange. So I'm a buyer. I buy some sugar at the port for this from this basically one's overseer, say Mr. Roberts, right? Mr. Roberts owns all. Let's say he's a West Indian planter. This person who buys the sugar will pay with a sterling bill of exchange. That piece of paper will go back to London, and it will be due. It will be payable in say £6,000, 90 days from the day it's delivered. So when I pay you, let's say you're in, your overseer or something like that, this bill of exchange, the overseer then mails the bill of exchange back on a ship to the West Indian planter, and the planter then cashes that bill of exchange in London, and it says, Samuel Oglethorpe or whatever will pay the person who has this bill of exchange in 90 days, £3,000. And so that's basically how the money gets back. No gold or silver passes back and forth. All of it is effectively through these sort of bill of exchange, which are kind of checks. They send multiple copies of them in case one of the ships sinks. So the landowner is paid by the representative with the sterling bill of exchange. The landowner gets the bill of exchange sent to him, and the landowner cashes the bill of exchange in London. Yeah, thanks, Alicia. That's a good question. So the old triangular trade was Britain sending manufacturers to Cuba and Jamaica. Well, let's say Jamaica and Barbados. So manufactured goods going from England to Barbados. Then, oh, sorry. Let me do this again. Okay, manufactured goods going from England to Africa for enslaved people. The Africans going from Africa to Jamaica, and then sugar and other things like that going back to England. England also hoped to sell manufactured goods to Jamaica and places like that, which would be a sort of the triangle in reverse, like the goods be going back to the New World. That's the hope. The trouble is that increasingly rum becomes once rum is developed and refined as a kind of product of the leftover parts of sugar, it becomes a very valuable and small and portable product. And what Rhode Island and other New England merchants do is they take this leftover junk from the Jamaican sugar market, which is basically molasses, but the kind of nastiest blackstrap molasses that you could expect. They turn it into rum. They send the rum on slave ships to the West African coast where they're traded for enslaved people, and then they're traded back to the West Indies. And so that's the new triangle. And that's how New Englanders are able to create a sort of new triangle over the old triangle, which was supposed to put England in the loop.